timing and calling, and that's ridiculous. The reason I have this is because I talk to my parents, I talk to my friends from home. Last night talked to my little brother for an hour, and it's a great way to keep in touch with them, hear about their day, hear their voices when they laugh, hear about all their experiences, and it just makes it super easy for communication. Right after that call, I was watching The Amazing Race, and on season 18, there's a mother-son duo, and the son is 100% deaf. And I started thinking, how can they have the kind of communication I do when I'm at school and they're away from each other? How do they have either that face-to-face voice communication or just voice communication? This is super important to us because we feel like voice-to-voice is the most important form of communication, but how does that affect deaf people when they can't have that? In high school, I learned some American Sign Language, not because that was my foreign language, I studied German, but because my dad's best friend had a son who was 100% deaf. They asked me if I would be able to learn sign language, just the light stuff like hungry, thank you, all those things, so that I could watch over him. This was extremely important to him because he didn't have the verbal communication like the rest of us get to have. I don't know if any of you took ASL and SEN in high school, but that's one of the biggest forms of foreign language now studied throughout public high schools. Words are not the primary source of communication for deaf people and even for us. There's so many different forms, different things of body language, facial feedback, and the way we use our hands and speak like I'm doing right now. It's how we get our point across without just our words because they don't carry that much weight, even if we think that they do. So let's begin with language acquisition, the words we use, and where they come from in the brain. So if you can look, there's a little bouncy looking arrow called language acquisition, and that mainly takes place in the left hemisphere of the brain near the midline, and it's called Broca's area, is what we use for actually word formation. This is connected to Wernicke's area, which is what we use to process the words that we hear and understand what's going on in our head. In an article called Language by Ling Yi Zhu, written in 2009, he made the statement about how we actually form our language ourselves, and even though there's not one specific pegged down form of language acquisition because it happens in so many different parts of the brain, the most accepted is called the natural theory, which is what Ling Yi Zhu talked about. And this means that when we are 2 months old, we begin cooing. And these are the verbal sounds that sound like vowels like ooh, ah, things like that. And once we get to 6 months old, that's when we begin the babbling, the nonsense, blah, 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 that we like to do with our parents, like my little brother did when he was little. He'd open up a book and just start babbling, thinking he was reading the words. And once a child actually gets to about 1.5 years old, between 12 and 18 months, that's when they actually start forming words. And the syntax isn't all there, the grammar isn't all there, but they can give commands like mommy, cookie, and they begin being able to give commands that way. There are other perspectives other than the natural theory, like I just stated, because it's not totally pegged down, so there are different ideas. The nativist perspective is a little bit degrading, but it means that language is only for children who are smart. If children are dumb, they're just never going to get it. So you just have to already have that in your brain, and if you don't, it's an unlearnable thing for you. Another theory is called the neural storehouse, and it means that it is already in our brain. We are hardwired to learn language and hardwired to have those specific steps as the cooing, the babbling, and then the actual formation of words like mommy, cookie. Now, for language acquisition of deaf people, I'm not going to go in specifically how deaf people acquire their hard of hearing or things like that because that's a whole different story. We're just going to talk about how they're able to communicate now. Communication is completely different for them because they don't have the words that we do. They have their sign language, which is very similar to words because they can communicate the words that they're trying to speak, but things like facial expressions are very important to them, and the sounds that they make. There's a bunch of different grunts and noises, and once you get close with someone, like the mother-daughter duo I saw in Amazing Race, he was able to make noises and have a certain facial expression, and she knew exactly what he was trying to convey, better than I feel like I could do with words. When deaf people go through language acquisition, up to the first year that I explained, all those steps, the cooing, the babbling, and the word formation, they all actually go through the same phase, according to The Roles of Babble and Language Acquisition by Valerie Wallace in 2003. They have all the same characteristics, and you wouldn't know that they're deaf unless testing occurred. Up until about a year, that's when they begin to have a volume control issue, which means that at about 1 year old, when the other kids are realizing words and hearing their parents talk to them and have a conversation, they realize they can tell the difference between ambient noise and the noise that they're making, but deaf children cannot. So they'll start to yell, they'll start to be extra audible, and that's when you start to notice the real difference in language acquisition for them. Now, with body language, this is when they start to learn that they have to rely more on that rather than their own words. Facial feedback, according to Dr. Paul Ekman in 1979, he was quoted in Facial Expressions, Emotions, and Sign Language. He made a statement saying that there's innate facial expressions that all humans have. This can be something like surprise when we raise our eyebrows. This is something that we can all do from birth, surprisingly. This isn't one of the ones that we learn from our parents, but others are, such as excitement. But there's always smiling and things like the surprise eyebrow raised that are just innate that we all have. So this is what helps the deaf children be able to communicate early on before they realize they have to rely more on hands and facial expressions. There are other visual cues, according to Philip Mutswanga in The Hands with Eyes and Nose in the Palm in 2017. He went over to Africa, to a bunch of different African countries such as Zimbabwe and I can't remember the second country right now. But he went over and talked with some African children who were deaf, and so they didn't speak the same sign language. They weren't able to speak American Sign Language, but they were able to have communication almost as well as we can just through their facial expression and the noises they made and the connection that they could form just based on the emotion you can see on their face and the body language they use. You could tell that when they were happy they had a wider stance, they were more open to talk to Mr. Ekman when they were there. This shows us how great it is that we're able to have communication other than just words, because words don't carry that much weight, according to the research I've done. It's based 80% they say, of our communication is bodily, whether that's facial expression communication or that's the way we use our bodies. This is extremely important because with the developmental differences with the deaf children, they're the same up until a year, but then they can't. So this is extremely important that we are able to communicate with people other than with words, because that's not going to carry much weight with what we do. Our emotions are so much stronger than that, and just words can't describe that. I know I can't find the right words sometimes when I'm trying to convey how I feel. So having more awareness that our body and the way we move our mouth and everything we do is so much more important. Thank you.